In the hour between night and morning on Coruscant, the air became a translucent river. The skyways thinned, the roaring traffic softened into a distant, tidal hush, and the city's countless lights drew a veil of muted color over the canyoned avenues. From the steep angles of the Jedi Temple's spires, the world below looked like a constellation fallen upon the planet, every window a small star caught in stone. Wind moved. That was all. It moved across the coppered faces of the temple statues and along the seams of the Durcrete buttresses. It slipped into the clefts where weathered steps met older foundations, went down and down into silent corridors and sleeping vaults. It moved over basins and the pale leaves of undergarden trees, set a quiet ring through the lanterns hung in cloisters, and made the water in hidden rills shiver with a silver skin. It went further still, down where columns squat like the trunks of vanished titans, into chambers that had once been designed to keep records and had become repositories for anything that frightened memory. In such a vault, there lay an object wrapped in awkwardly simple cloth. It had the plainness of an old farmhand's shawl, the sort no one would look at twice. It was placed within a room of no ornament. There were no guardian statues, no inscriptions, no ambient lights keeping vigil. Lonely the moonlight glow cast through a grate from the waterway beyond, and the line of dust on the threshold that looked undisturbed for years at a time. The cloth's weave had failed in places, and through those seams, metal gave off a faint gleam, not the proud shine of parade steel, but the dull glow of something that retained a memory of lightning. Around the bundle, the air felt colder, although any readout would have disputed it. If a person had been present, they would have marked the sensation as the way a storm makes the skin awake in advance of thunder. The object waited, as it had waited, as objects invented for single purposes must wait. It slept by listening. It felt across stone and water and traffic, across breath and troubled dreams, across the whole uncountable grid of Coruscant, for that one note that matched its edge. And when it found it, as it had, more times than anyone living could number, it drew that note gently, as a blade draws a whisper from a whetstone, and sent it back along the grain of the galaxy. Far above, a gardener in the room of 1,000 fountains woke without knowing why. He sat up from the bench, half alert, listening to the layered voices of water. From the fountain's tears came bright falling noises and the broader undertone of the big pool, where koi turned in slow, thoughtful loops. Drip, fall. Hush. He heard the slightest thread between them, like a filament of sound drawn taut as a bowstring. He frowned, then smiled at himself, and lay down again, and in laying down he turned his head just so that a beam of reflected light from the surface of the pool lay over his closed eyes. He slept, and the light became a desert. Elsewhere, in the dormitories where the youngest of the order dreamed in the easy, exhausted way of children, one girl stirred, then went perfectly still. She was hearing snow, though she had never seen it. The sound of it falling was the exact sound of the silence after the fountain's voices. A boy down the row turned onto his stomach and set his hand under his cheek. He was seeing a forest he would one day stand within, and a light moving between trunks at the height of a man's chest. And though the forest had not yet grown to that fullness, and though he had never heard leaves breathe like that, he accepted the vision as a child accepts weather, and his hand twitched around a hilt shaped of air. The cloth-wrapped blade listened to these. It took nothing from them. It added a weightless measure, a line, a hint at direction, so that what they would have dreamed became slightly more exact. That was its design. It did not command. It guided. But in guiding, it changed. On the temple's eastern side, a small door opened upon a staircase that descended with the stubbornness of a miner's shaft. The man who had the key did not often come this way anymore. The order had grown over the last 3 decades, and the pressures of war had taken him out of the habit of visiting these places that required patience. He stood above the first step and looked down into the darkness, then at his hand holding the key. He was not a man to linger between actions. He put the key back into his robe and descended into the short, dry, depthless dark that underground places retain like a preference. Qui-Gon Jinn's breath made a small cloud in the air. Not from cold. He had fought in deserts, and in the sort of jungles that make thought sink and slow. But from some other change of pressure, the skin understands before the mind names. He did not kindle the lamp. His hand knew the rail. The remaining fail-safe lights along the stairs were kept low, down between the steps themselves, shining upward through frosted quartz like the shy glow of buried stars. He had been younger the first time he came here, and alone then, as he was now. He had told no one, not even his apprentice. The council did not forbid these places, but they suffered them. And the difference between tolerance and trust was not one Qui-Gon ignored. He descended until he reached the door in the landing, a plain door with its handle worn to a satin. He pressed it. It yielded at the correct pressure, a compliance that had been set into it triumphantly by the artisan who had installed the spring. The artisan would have died before the spires had reached their current height, never knowing how his spring had lasted. But the door's gratitude remained in its smooth swing. He stepped into the vault. To the right, the old waterway in the rock made its dull mirror, and to the left, the bundle lay where he had placed it 20 years earlier. He stopped his breath, the way a swimmer stops at the edge of a lake at night to let his eyes adjust. He did not name the thing in his mind, because names make objects vivid and present, and that was not wise with a tool that turned ambiguity into clarity. Stillness settled on him. The city moved and did not touch him. The far sigh of fans in ventilation shafts, the drowse of air through cables, the tiny tremor of footfalls in an adjacent hall, all went by him like water by a rock. "Qui-Gon," said the room, with the intonation of a remembered friend. He stood with the windless patience of a tree. The room said his name again in the same way, and behind the name a question stood in its clean line. "You brought it back here," the question implied, "and left it sleeping. You told yourself, better here than in a hand whose need outshouts its balance. You told yourself, better here than among the infinite small wants of the galaxy. But then you began to hear it anyway, behind the turbulence of daily things, behind your apprentice telling you a very practical truth, behind the council's courteous obstructions, behind your own insistence that the living force is sufficient without sharp instruments. You hear it now. What will you do?" Qui-Gon let the question cross him. He closed his eyes. In the dark behind his lids he did not see any blaze of revelation, no trumpet of insight. He saw a street, dry and chalky, under a sun that made jar handles painful to touch. Market stalls. A woman's hand wiping sweat to her shoulder with a practiced, dismissive motion, and a boy moving between slabs of shade, so naturally that the air welcomed him. The boy's hand was on a handhold of some craft, and his smile was the one children wear when they are about to show you something they have made from nothing and wire. He had seen this street in his sleep every third night for a season now. He had tried not to question it. He had tried to keep the discipline he prized most. The discipline of letting the present inform the present and not the other way around. But there was a pressure in the vision that was unlike his other dreams. There was the barest sense of a filament, a drawn thing like thin steel, set along the dream's length, not encumbering it, not replacing it, but adding to it, and that addition changed the dream's quality from a vagrant thought to direction. "You are still guiding," he said quietly into the room. "After all these years." He crossed to the bundle with a carefulness that would have shamed him in any other context. He stood above it and did not touch it. He reached out in the force and did not grasp it that way either. He looked at the cloth's fray and at the dullness of the metal where it showed through. In the force, it was a line of silence. Everything else made sound like water. It was a flaw in the water. It parted things. And with this parting came sight. He saw the woman again, the boy, the chalk, the sun. He saw the farther horizon, wavy with heat. He saw a desert that could not dream of rivers, a world of scarcity, and a brightness so unqualified it made luxuries out of shade and a sip. He saw the boy at the heart of it, as if he were a spring covered by a broken stone. Under his ribs something that had never been properly named stirred, that sense of the force as it exists in the person standing right now on dusty stone. Breath, pulse, the way the eye makes a line into the world, and the world makes a line back. The room listened to him listening. When he left the vault, he did not take the wrapped blade. He climbed the stairs into the morning wind that now moved among the temple's flags, and made the newly lit windows look as if they had been wet from long rain. He went out into the city whose day had begun, and he did what he had always done. He moved with the living force. But the line that had touched his dream went with him like a thought that refuses to be put down. In the days that followed, he found himself looking more often at his apprentice, at Obi-Wan's careful mouth, and the managed impatience in his hands. Obi-Wan took notes in his precise way, and asked the sort of questions that kept Qui-Gon honest, which was a favor when the order was as old as it was, and as respectful of its own habits. He watched the way the boy had grown into his face and tried to imagine how much of his own stubborn streak Obi-Wan saw when he looked back at his master. He had thought, years ago, that the order was a ship, and the galaxy an ocean, and it was enough to keep the ship afloat and moving true. But he had come to believe it was also a garden, and what you tended would one day either feed you or starve you. He looked at Obi-Wan and tried not to plant a seed he would one day regret by giving him too much of his own taste for stepping sideways through doors the council and the code left closed. He could feel the precise day the vision sharpened its line. He and Obi-Wan were on a landing platform, the air gritty with blown dust even at that altitude, when he felt the drawn filament become a cord. Something out there called not for violence, or for the tidy closure of victory, but for arrival. It might have been old habit to ignore it. He had long practice ignoring the glamorous music of rumors and cause, and the insistence of other people's emergencies. But this was not the cry of crisis. It was a single place, simply being itself, and requiring the arrival of a man shaped to meet it. He did not tell Obi-Wan the truth of it even then. He said they would make a short diversion before reporting to the council. He said there was a supply acquaintance to see in the mid-rim, and that they could test an idea about fuel staging on long-haul missions. Obi-Wan accepted the words as he had learned to accept most of his master's words, as a surface over depth. In that he was generous. He trusted the depth would become audible when it mattered, and he made his notes anyway. The wrapped blade slept on. In its sleep it fed a suggestion into other dreams with the same patience with which a baker kneads bread. It was not free to choose the content. It only sharpened the line in what was already present. So, in the night when the order's midday brightness finally flickered, as war came to the corridors like a river switching sides, the blade whispered its line into a mind it had once known as precise and severe, and given to obeying his own conscience with the same illuminated stubbornness with which he obeyed rules. Count Dooku dreamed of pillars falling in long, falling rows. He woke and put his hand once to his chest, where the habit of his braid used to live. Then in the morning, he went to say things that would sound like prophecies and would become decisions. Years later, when old Master Yoda walked not in the depths, but along the high garden's narrow paths, he heard far away a voice whose timbre belonged to no creature of bone and lung, a voice that had once gone with a man whose laugh had been like a door being opened with surety. At the corner of a turning he paused in the shadow of a tree whose leaves were shaped like coins. They quivered, giving out their thin, tidy sound. Master Yoda stood there, and the sound braided itself with the wash of fountains into the same tight thread the blade loved. He closed his eyes and let his green fingers rest along the cane's smoothness. The voice said his name the way wind says the side of a cliff, and he knew again what the living force does when it discovers a line like a blade's edge inside experience. It tests itself, and the test, when understood, becomes a door. He went to the vault. He had been here before. He had granted the decision to keep the object here on Coruscant, because the alternative was a story in which the object lived in rumor, and would be sought by men who loved edges, more than things being slowly true. He entered the room, and stood with the light from the grate laying its pale cloth over his feet. The bundle lay unremarkably in its place. He did not touch it. He spoke to it, as the very old sometimes speak to their walking sticks. Once, here we chose, he said, for the order and for the world. Chose the quiet for the sharpness to sleep. Chose perhaps also blindness. Chose a quiet that dulled our ears. Cleverness we had. What you are. A lesson too. Mess. The object did not answer. It sent the slightest of currents outward and downward, not at him, but past him, into that lower seam in the city's stone where the world below the temple kept its own council. The older shrine that the people who had built the temple had weighed and counterweighted. That slow darkness like a cooled tongue of lava within the bedrock. That place breathed faintly. The object's out-breath touched it. The darkness made no sign, but the meeting was recorded the way a tide line is recorded by kelp on a beach. Yoda lifted his head and stared as if he had been struck. He could smell the old dryness under the wash of water. He could smell a stone that had once been heated to whiteness, and then left to blacken and cool. The living force, never ashamed of naming what it encountered, said simply, "Balance requires resistance." And he nodded, his ears folding inward with age and recognition. "What sleeps, wakes," he said softly, as if to finish a sentence someone else began long ago. "And what wakes sleeps again." He went away. He climbed, slowly. Above, the fountain's voices resumed their weave. In the dormitories children dreamed, and one of them, she was 14, and knew she was neither the best nor the worst at anything, sat up and held her hand out in the night and felt the way air settled along her skin. She leaned forward and whispered to it as if to a small animal, soothing it into remaining. It was not a trick. It was the beginning of discipline. She smiled and fell back to the pillow. Anakin Skywalker would be a man before the blade's line found him in any awake place. But it had already found him in that market street, under that brutal, bright sky. The line had kissed his days when he built little things from wire and scavenged parts. And the fact that those little things worked taught his hands to expect futures. His mother would look at him when he was asleep, and sometimes see his fingers flex as if he held a tool, or a hand, or the edge of something not meant to be held lightly. In his sleep, sometimes the line led him into an empty field of white, where sound was distant, and his heart beat, seemed to him an engine kept too tight. Years later, when the city had made him into a man, when Coruscant's high windows had put their shine on his eyes, and the Order had called him chosen, and given him training that could make of a person either a bridge or a blade, the line sang in his nights with a clarity like coal. He would wake and go out to the balcony of Padme's apartment and feel the wind lifting off the city's million facets, lifting higher, pushing the sweat away from his skin with its professional tenderness. He loved that wind. He loved the city as a proof of what hands could do with will and with skill. He looked down on it the way a pilot looks at instruments. He felt the line in his chest and thought it was fear. When he thought it was fear, he tried to control it. When he tried to control it, it acted like anything pressed too hard. It slipped. Padme would wake sometimes and come to stand with him. Her presence made the wind a warmer thing. It made the city seem both closer and less demanding. He would stand with her and watch the advertising towers perform their slow dances for no one, for everyone. He would tell her that the dreams had begun again. She would set her hand between his shoulder blades where the tension built and say that she trusted him. And he, who could take a machine apart blindfolded and name every sound in a damaged engine, could not name the sensation under her hand, because it was not a fault to be replaced, but a line through which the world was being drawn. The wrapped blade in the vault to the east slept in its clean room, and felt him sense it without knowing. It felt him turn, and the line in him was like a river shot at high speed through a gorge. The blade did not do this. It only recorded the pressure and made the edges of what already was a little more distinct. Ahsoka Tano, much younger than Anakin but already in the full possession of that specific bravery that comes from brains meeting training at speed, would later feel that same edge in a place where skies were too wide to be believed, and time's gears sometimes showed through their casing. She would stand with two men whose love for each other was everywhere in their arguing, and she would learn how a story behaves when it is asked to be a map. She would feel the blade's suggestion in that place. She would feel how it seeks the smallest motion that can change a descent into a landing. Something in her would recognize the modesty in it, and refuse outrage, even when outrage would have been understandable. She would make the difficult decisions that go with modesty, and with telling the truth in small, repeated ways, until a life is made of them. When she returned from that place, She would visit the fountains and stand as the water said its layered syllables. She would feel again that filament of sound between streams, and with the unglamorous courage of one who has already passed through a hall of mirrors and did not worship at any of them, she would listen as if she were apprenticing in listening itself. The air would lay its cool hand along the open tendrils of her montrals, and she would understand that the object in the vault, and the larger architecture of what it meant, was not her inheritance. It was her warning. Visions, yes. Guideposts, yes. But the blade, never again would a blade be in a hand to decide truth. Down in the city, much farther away than it looks from the temple's heights, a boy of 12 would run along a walkway's margin to arrive home before curfew. He would be late. He would cut a corner along a crowded market, and a cart would tilt just then, and a rain of thin metal rods would fall. One of them would have speared his foot like a neat nail. Instead, the object that slept under the temple would move the smallest fraction of suggestion through the weave of the world, and the boy would pivot without knowing why, and the rod would strike the floor at his heel. He would run on, unharmed and sure of nothing but speed, and the city would take him in like a large room taking in a small breath. Another 20 years, and the temple would be an emptied hive. That first night after the doors shut, and the lights in the great halls remained dark, scavengers with good administrative contacts came with keys, and took what the new authority had not yet catalogued. But they did not find the parcel in the plain vault. Few remembered that room's route, fewer cared, and fewer yet got pleasure from such air. The bundle remained on its quiet shelf. The city outside was obedient and tired. Windows still shone, now in the careful configurations the new laws preferred. Two men walked past each other on a narrow bridge over an air shaft, and did not look up. A woman stood by a rail and stared at her hands until they stopped shaking, then went home. A droid swept a plaza designed to look older than it was. The fountain still fell in the room built for them, although no one came to notice that one of the silver throat holes had acquired a different pitch. The building was not a body anymore. It was a skull. The water's voices remained vowels without words. The object in its cloth listened. There were nearly no Jedi left to dream, so it guided elsewhere. It brushed against the mind of a man whose job it was to walk certain halls and ensure that they stayed clean. He was no Force adept by any measure, but he was a human animal, and so his sleep held shapes. The object made one of those shapes sharper, enough that the man woke with an exact knowledge that the door to a small mechanical room off the second lower corridor had been left unsecured. He rose, drew on his coat, took his key, went to the place, locked the door, and returned to his apartment, where his wife rolled toward him and set her hand on his chest and on the ridges of his ribs. Neither of them might have known this, that if that door had remained open, a thief would have come through a chain of access ways and taken from the room beyond a case of crystals destined to be ground to nothing and used to feed engines, and in taking that case he would have woken a boy sleeping in an adjacent storage closet. And then the boy would have cried out, and then the thief would have silenced him, and then the man's wife would have woken later and felt a change in the air and set her hand to his chest. Instead, the door was locked. The thief, meeting resistance small and immediate, went away. The boy dreamed on. The man's chest rose under his wife's hand, and in the morning they argued over breakfast about nothing with relief none of them could name. Far from Coruscant, under trees old enough to lean, Master Yoda sat on a root and watched mist take all the edges away from everything. He had found a cave here where edges collected, a naturally faulted place where sight grew sharp at a cost. He had not dug the cave, but his steps had joined the steps of others and made the threshold smooth. He sent a student there later and watched as a boy with good hands and a face that would one day be stern stepped into that condensate of visions and lifted a lightsaber against what he feared and learned precisely this, that the blade, any blade, makes an answer too quickly. It takes the question, it halves it, and it returns you two halves that look clean and that are only shards of what was whole. The object in the temple liked this lesson, if a thing can be said to like. It was never insulted. It was used, and it was not used. It was returned. It was left. It slept. It woke. Through all of that, it continued to draw the line through the weft of dreams, making what was already there precise. Before it, a man could dream he would fall in love and choose duty instead, and be wrong and be good. After it, the man would know the smell of the room in which he would betray himself. He would remember the way the afternoon light had made a row of vessels, on a shelf a series of thin suns, and when he came to that room years later, he would recognize it, and his decisions would become less an improvisation and more a replication of something that already had been rehearsed. Being told the future is a coercion. Being guided toward a future the heart already holds is a collaboration. The object could not tell. It could only guide. That was the secret. Perhaps only one person, inside the whole old order, ever understood it without resentment, and that was the man whose laugh had made doors seem willing to be opened. He had not taken the object with him. He had chosen instead to let the living force say yes or no to him directly, and to let the object make 100 small yeses and nos easier for people who did not know they were at thresholds. Where the temple met the oldest stone, the older shrine slept on. Its breath made a constant, faint current through the rock. The object lay within reach of that current without being affected. But one night, the older current turned slightly, as if a massive animal sleeping under the hill had set its head down in a new place. The object felt that shift and perceived a new line in it. The possibility that the city would one day breathe again, and that the new green things planted in old courtyards would grow. It was a faint line. If a person had been in the room then, they would have thought it no more than the difference of a draft. But the object indexed it, and when a woman years later stood under the rebuilt spire and tilted her head and said with that wholly human authority that a thing was possible because the trembling in her arms told her it was, the object added a crumb of precision to her conviction. And she smiled and asked for more soil to fill the roots basin. Sifo-Dyas had long since become a story people told when they wanted to warn the young against faith in their own private storms. He had seen ships and death and numbering, and believed himself obliged to answer visions with projects, rather than with questions. He had taken the blade's sharpening as a kind of call. He had died in an unwitnessed place. That death had gone into the city like iron filings into a quiet pool. For certain men, it had been the exact weight their plans needed. For one man, it had been the sluice gate that turned pity into certainty. The object had guided the sight, not the ethics. That had been, and would always be, the human's task. Obi-Wan would stand one day on a platform and feel the city's wind move under his robe, and into the worn places where cloth thinned from duty and from travel. He would think of his master. He would remember the plain door in the underground, and a room that smelled faintly of water and metal. He would remember the seriousness with which a person he loved had chosen not to take a thing he might have. He would think of the boy he had trained, and of the man that boy had become, and of the costs exacted by clarity when it came too soon. He would feel, like a line set along his ribs, the knowledge that clarity can cut before compassion has learned its whole vocabulary. He would feel the blade's idea without the blade itself, that some edges must be approached only with hands emptied of judgment. He would meet later, in a cave, the sort of vision a person meets the day they are ready for it. He would hold later still in his arms a boy who would never be anything but a child to him in the ways that matter. He would watch a sun set twice. He would submit himself to a change so absolute that the words used to describe it had always sounded like faith even to those who do not believe. The object in the vault would perceive that moment with the exact awareness with which a stone perceives the rain, by registering the pressure in the ground and by accepting it without commentary. Ahsoka would fight not to become a blade and would succeed, which is rarer than anyone admits. There are battles a person wins by refusing to make them into battles. She would become fluent in the vocabulary compassion requires to hold evil without copying it. When she stood again inside a place where time had been allowed to show its bones, and felt a breath like her old master's on her cheek, as if a door had opened without a person to open it, she would know the object was near her not as metal is near, but as the exactness of a thought is near after a long walk. She would choose again not to take it. She would step back from edges. She would let the line be inside her without needing it to be made of anything but her decision to see, and not to divide too soon. In the vault, dust settled. The cloths, threads frayed, until they became something like hair. The metal's dullness acquired the patina of tempering and of long air. To anyone who might have come by chance, it would have looked like a ruined trinket put aside by an absent-minded novice. But in the night, it sometimes made the smallest click, a sound no ear could catch, the sound of an idea turning a degree on its axis inside a mind. And when the city's air passed through the grate in the wall, the wind took that click and made it, to itself, into a note it carried outward through halls that had once bristled with the hum of training, and the laughter of those who were very young, and not yet tasked with saving anything. On one of those nights, a girl who was not a Jedi, and never would be one, not because she could not have been trained, but because the world had ceased to offer that path to a child like her, sat in a tenement's high corner room, and fixed a broken emitter with a length of wire and a clamp, meant for plumbing. She did not know why she had reached for the emitter when she woke. She only knew her fingers had found it without looking. She set her lamp to a low yellow tone and watched solder flow like a river made of mirrors. She felt the exact moment when the alignment was true. She felt that truth with the back of her neck. It was a good thing to feel. She smiled and put the emitter aside. She would sell it in the morning, and the money would make the difference between hunger and food for 6 days. She would never imagine that under the temple's stone something had sharpened her sleep, so she could find that particular wire in a pile of wire in a dark room. Years folded like the pages of a book in a slow hand. The city made way for the second set of banners in a generation. People who had been old became older. Those who had been born under one law woke into another without moving. The rebuilt spire kept its angle with an almost comical honesty, as if it had decided that even its silhouette must no longer lie. The fountains resumed their arguments and their agreements. Koi grew, remembered being small, forgot that they had ever been carried in pails down service corridors by men who did not want to trouble the larger fish. In the vault, the cloth at last failed along one of its seams, and a small triangle of metal skin tasted open air. The sensation was nothing to the object, and everything to the city's dreamers that year. That winter, on a world far from Coruscant, a woman kept watch over a small fire, and felt herself held between two futures, with a calm so exact she could have measured it with a scale. She could imagine her daughter's face under each future, and did not hate the hard one more than the other. The object noted this. The line that ran through her sleep was like a wire strung between beams, and she walked along it without fear. It had always been this way. Before certain names were known and services held for them, before temples were built here at all, before the city learned to express wealth in height and number and light, there had been other rooms and other blades, and other visions sharpened by edges that were literal and that later became metaphor. The living force insists on this. That meaning, if it is to stand, must pass by way of breath, and of fear, and of choosing a course at a crossroads most of us cannot even describe. If there is a tool that makes a crossroads look like a clean corridor, it must be hidden, and taught to be ashamed of itself, until those who would most love it have grown too old to go looking. The object accepted its shame. It slept. And still there were nights when the wind dipped and curled, and the vault received air that had moved over 1,000,000 cheeks, and through the heat thrown off by 100 little motors, and in that air were particles like letters and like the dust of salted stone. And in that air also were messages that had never been put into words. Panic given off by a crowd then settled into a hush, elation shed like heat by twu piup. The object listened to such messages. It made them sharper when asked by the skin of a sleeper to do so. It gave them back with only their own contents refined. And sometimes this meant a person woke with the exact name of the hill they needed to climb next. Sometimes it meant waking with the emptiness needed to ask again. If it had been a person, it would have had stories to tell about small salvations. It would have told you about the boy with the metal rods, and about a pilot who dreamed of a line along his route that would lead him, with an extra turn, around a storm that would have cost him a wing. It would have told you about a woman who decided to write a letter and did not, and because she did not, a rumor died unborn and stayed dead, and a friendship lived. It would have told you about the dream a man had after failing in a very public way. In the dream he sat beside water, and watched light move over its skin, and realized that he had been trying to be useful to a story rather than to a person, and that the difference was a kind of blade. And when he woke, he understood exactly whom to speak to, and how to say I was wrong without turning wrong into a thief. But the object was not a person. It was only itself. Metal at a particular temper, designed for a moment so difficult that the galaxy had barely had the coherence to hold it, then left to sleep because the living must continue after climaxes, because the day after a battle needs bread and beds made, and 100 things that cannot be done with an edge. Tools outlive ceremonies. Values outlive tools. The object waited for both. When at last someone came who knew what they were looking at, they came without fanfare. The woman's boots were wet when she entered the vault. She had come through a passage infrequently used, and she had done that because she did not want to disturb the koi with lights. She had navigated by the memory of places. In the old days she had been called by a rank. Now she had given those away in exchange for something less legible, which is to say, a quieter authority. She stepped into the room and stopped there, just inside the threshold, because stopping at thresholds had become her custom. Her montrals inclined toward the shape on the shelf, the way a flower turns, without its own consent, toward light. She did not reach for it. She did not even move toward it. She let the line it drew through the room touch her exactly as much as her breath would allow. A door. She said to the air, not to be opened. It was not piety. It was an engineer's statement about a structure's integrity. She stood with her hands folded but not in prayer. Stood the way a person stands when they are letting a tune they once knew come all the way back to them, before risking humming. She remembered his laugh. She remembered a hall like a thought in which time showed its gears. She remembered how many times moving forward had required refusing the tool that would have made moving forward clean, quick, drama-flavored. She breathed the air in the room that smelled like water and like metal. She pictured the movement of the older current in the stone below. She let the knowledge settle. Then she smiled once and left the room without a sound. Outside, the city's morning had a new crispness. Workmen carried young trees in big cloth slings along the temple's eastern edge. A girl held a laminated schedule against her thigh and moved her lips as she memorized it. A very young boy watched a speeder's polished side until his face appeared in it, and then practiced smiling at himself without showing teeth. The fountains kept at their sentences. That night, under the old stars that had looked down at both the first stones and the last banners and found themselves unchanged, the object found a dream it wished to tend. The dream belonged to a child in a world that had never learned the word for snow, and had never counted a fish that was not food. The child dreamed of a path along a ridge and of the way wind pushes into your chest from the front and becomes a thing you can push against. The object made the ridge a little narrower. The child opened their eyes and understood that in waking life the path would be narrow too. They laughed because they had never before considered that a narrow path was not a threat, but a guarantee of arrival, if walked carefully. In the morning they set stones along a real path, and their mother, watching, smiled the way a person smiles when they cannot see the end of the work, but recognize the sentence that begins it. On Coruscant, in the temple's gardens, a leaf shook itself free from the holdfast with a reluctance so slight that only the most patient could have seen it happen. It fell. It touched water and rode outward on the push of other falling things. Its journey was short and complete. The object slept on. The line that ran through it remained true. It would remain true whether anyone named it. It had always had the same intention: to make of what is already present a map, and then to pass that map to hands able to understand that maps are not orders but invitations. By then, the city had lived long enough to know how to welcome invitations. It put a chair out in the morning sun for a man whose back hurt. It put clean cups on the grid of a cafe table for a conversation that would become a plan to repair a school. It left a door unlocked so a child could come home without knocking and learn that mercy sometimes looks like carelessness. The object received these as a musician receives the tuning in a hall and gave back a fraction of precision, just enough that a person standing at the edge of a choice could feel the small gravity of the better course. Sometimes, not often, it remembered. Not as minds remember, but as acoustics remember. The brightness of an impossible sky over a place where time is the wall of a room that can be walked through. It remembered the way hands had gripped it with an intention so pure that even rage could not cloud it, and the neatness of the moment that had followed, a neatness terrible enough to make centuries reconsider their affection for clarity. It let that echo pass. It lay quiet. In the morning, a woman whose daughter had not come home on time woke into the exactness she needed to go to the place where her daughter sat quietly counting the stripes on a municipal bench. And because she arrived there, and because she then did the unremarkable thing, and said nothing about fear and everything about hunger, both of them stood and went home to eat, and the bench kept their heat a while, and then released it into the air as a little weather for passerby to inherit. The galaxy continued. War broke in places and was mended in others. Schools produced graduates who could make things and not only arguments. The order, remembered in fragments and in wholehearted books with gilded titles, became again what old things become when the living find uses for them. A series of small acts a person can perform without costumes. A man on a transport guided his panic into careful listening and averted tragedy. A child felt a force at a fork in a trail and chose the path covered in wind-fallen needles, rather than the path that smelled like a dare. They found ripe berries and came home stained and proud. In a quiet room, a woman set her hand above another's heart and heard in her own head the exact word that would let the other speak. And when the other spoke, a long story ended without any ending being announced. And in the vault on Coruscant, the cloth-wrapped thing adhered to its purpose without regret. Nights thinned before mornings. The city kept its lights. Far away, a man stood under two suns and did a task that belongs to men at the end of their usefulness, which is to become completely useful for a moment that will outlast them. A young woman told a student of hers, "There is no hurry," and meant it. And the student, weeping a little, believed her and slept. And his sleep was the kind that mends the interior of a person's house without redrafting its foundations. When, much later, someone asked Ahsoka if she believed in tools that could alter sight, she cleaned the edge of her teacup with her thumb and looked at the way steam is a prayer with no addressee and said, "I believe that sometimes the galaxy lets us see the line of what is already in us, and that if we are lucky, something makes that line clear." She did not say the name of any place or any room. She did not say anything about blades. When the questioner left, she stood for a while at a high window and watched wind cut its careful courses through trees, watched how every leaf's small choice made a pattern that could not have been predicted. She smiled, very slightly. The city made a small sound in the afternoon that was exactly the sound of cloth being lifted from a shelf, or perhaps of a violinist moving the bow an inch along the string to find the right place. She kept watching until the sound was gone, which is to say, until it had become part of the air, the object. That it would wake when breath needed sharpening. It would guide where the living force allowed it to guide. It would, when asked by sleeping minds, return to them the smallest necessary line. It would do this without receiving thanks and without needing secrecy. Because secrecy implies shame, and this was not shameful. It was only dangerous to those who love answers more than they love people. The city that held it would continue to be what cities are when they are at their best, a field of chances. The galaxy would continue to be what galaxies are when they are most themselves, a wide wind over innumerable thresholds. And among thresholds, there would always be one that asked not for a blade, but for a breath. The fountains went on speaking. The koi turned. Morning came so slowly that no one could say when it had begun. In the vault, the cloth lifted a fraction from metal, as if a ghost hand had checked that everything was still as it should be, and finding it so, withdrew. Outside on a platform, a child looked up and saw a ship descending and pointed and called to those nearby to look also. And the people turned their faces upward, and their faces received the engine light without flinching, and for a breath all of them together saw something arrive, and felt what it is to be guided toward arrival, and not to